Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm Tami, fibromyalgia coach, author, and founder of the International Fibromyalgia Coaching Institute. The goal of this podcast is to empower you with access to the dream team of experts and coaches I've discovered are key to living the fibro life you love. From the comfort of your own home, and maybe even your pajamas, I'll help you take back control of your life and health. To help out with FibroFog, I always include full show notes and additional resources at fibromyalgiapodcast.com. You're listening to the Fibromyalgia Podcast with Tami, episode 51. Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm your coach, Tami. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking with my friend Jodi about how to cope with social isolation and the loss of holidays with family. I know this has been a big thing for many of you right now with things going back on lockdown during the pandemic. And it might be things you're already dealing with. Maybe this is your first year with fibromyalgia, and that's making things more challenging too. Before we dive into today's episode, I have our listener shout out as usual. This comes from a comment that was made on our Facebook post, and this was from Stacy McCracken, who says, "Great tips in this episode. After listening, I didn't feel so bad about having brain fog." Now, the episode she's talking about is episode 46, which is my top 10 brain fog tips. So, Stacy, I am so glad that that helped you feel better about your own brain fog. I do share some of my own real life stories in there, so maybe that'll help you guys all feel better. But do go check that out. We'll have the link to that episode in today's show notes at fibromyalgiapodcast.com/51. Now, I would love to introduce you to Jodi Taub, who is our guest on today's episode. Jodi is a licensed clinical social worker. She's a psychotherapist with a private practice in New York City. She has over 20 years of direct care experience with children, adolescents, and adults. She practices individual, couples, family, and group therapies and specializes in treating issues related to mood and anxiety disorders, as well as all the emotional issues that arise from coping with chronic illness and disease. Jodi has her own chronic illnesses that she will actually talk about during the interview, and I love that she works both professionally and personally with that. It definitely makes her a lot more relatable, as you will hear in our interview today. Now, I do want to give a quick disclaimer here. Of course, while Jodi is trained to give professional medical advice in these situations, she is not your physician or healthcare provider. So please understand that what we share today is meant to be general information and education and not intended to take the place of talking with your therapist or your physician. Now, as we talk through today's episodes, we really are addressing a lot of what's happening right now as we record it, which is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving here in the U.S., and a lot of people are really struggling with everything going back on lockdown due to the COVID pandemic and also, the loss of the holidays and everything else. Now, I realize you may be listening to this after the fact, but do know that everything that we talk about in this episode is totally applicable, whether it's the holidays or not, whether we're dealing with the COVID pandemic or not. They are all very good advice for just how to deal with the social isolation that comes with a chronic illness and having access to therapies, loss of important events, maybe struggling to go to holidays or other events. I think you'll find a lot of information here. Super helpful. So enjoy my conversation with Jodi. All right. Hi, Jodi. Welcome. I'm so glad that you were able to be here to talk with us a little bit more about coping during the holidays. So welcome.
Hi, Tammy. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, over the last, I don't know, probably since everything went on lockdown back in March, I've gotten a lot of people who have messaged or clients asking, just talking about how do we deal with the isolation? I mean, we already, a lot of us, fibromyalgia can be very isolating. And then now we're on lockdown too. And I don't know about where you are, but here in Washington, we just took a step back in the last week or so. That also means right now a lot of things we would normally be doing in the holidays we're not doing, right? No Thanksgiving, big Thanksgiving dinners with all the people. So I would love for you. I know a little bit about your story, but I think it would be good for people to know the context that you're speaking from, that you're not just a healthy person who happens to like want to talk about this. Like you've got your own story.
Well, I guess the best way to start is I never stopped the lockdown. And the reason why is I have 24 healthcare conditions now. So it's quite a few. But the overarching issue is that I have a disease called primary immunodeficiency, which prior to COVID, people would stare at me and be like, what does that mean? COVID's actually been very helpful for me in explaining um, actually what my disease is. So basically, my immune system doesn't function appropriately, and I don't have the antibodies that appropriately respond to viruses and bacterial infections. So as a result, most of the systems in my body have some sort of issue. So I have a whole slew of autoimmune conditions and lots of different healthcare conditions that many people here may have. We're now up to 24. But the overarching thing is the primary immunodeficiency. And because of this rare genetic condition, my body can't recognize pathogens. So I get chronic persistent infections. So COVID was my worst nightmare. And so, yeah. And so, even more relatable now as they're talking about antibody functioning and resistance. I'm like, this is my world, epidemiology and viruses. So every 2 weeks, I get IVIG, which is immunoglobulin plasma, which they've been talking about in terms of fighting COVID, and I get that to all of other people's antibodies to all of the other known diseases. So by getting other people's antibodies, I'm able to fight off measles, mumps, rubella, pneumonia. Obviously, not COVID quite yet. So we're not quite there. And as a result of this, I do have a lot of other healthcare conditions, not limited to, but I have asthma and ulcerative colitis and Hashimoto's and polycystic ovarian disease. And I can go on and on to the 24. And I'm also a COVID long hauler. We believe that I got COVID in February at the spread in New York, and now I have COVID toes and vascular issues related to that. So I know there's a lot of people out there who also are COVID long haulers. So during this time, I have been isolating. So I understand not only from a therapeutic perspective what isolation means, but also from my own personal perspective. I had to leave New York City because I could not get the ongoing healthcare that I needed in a safe way when the first lockdown happened. But ongoing, because of the issues and the risk that I have, it wasn't safe for me to stay. And we were able to move out temporarily to Cleveland and then now in Long Island, where I can safely, isolate and not come in contact with people. So that's my long winded story of me.
Right, right. And I know the last time that we talked, one of the things that you said was, being in New York, the living spaces are much smaller. And even just like leaving your apartment, going down the elevator, you'd come in contact with all kinds of people. So,
Yeah. I would count walking my dog, just coming into my lobby and going in the doormat outside and come in contact with about 30 people. So we took this as an opportunity to get some space and try some suburban living. And, so it's a different type of lifestyle. But that's one, nice thing that came about COVID too is change. But I know that a lot of people are feeling isolated. And I think it's very interesting as we think about this whole sort of 8-month process. There was the period in the beginning where, we were on lockdown and everybody sort of was feeling this sense of fear. And there were different things going on in the different states. And then there was a period during the summer where people had freedom again and were able to do things. And now we're going into this other portion where I think people are starting to exhibit a different type of feeling, because when we first went down in lockdown, there was a fear around it, but it was the first time that we were doing it. So a lot of people sort of were in fight or flight, and but we're all kind of doing this together. Our freedoms were taken away, then they were slowly given back. Now it's sort of like, oh, wait a second, I remember that. And many of us, I think most states now at this point, are becoming more restricted at this time.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely what we've seen here in Washington. Definitely have been taking a step back, and it's almost a little bit, I don't know, it feels a little bit demoralizing, I think, because we thought we were doing so well, and then now we're not, and it's just like, oh, again.
Exactly. And I think that that's even harder because there's more sort of like PTS trauma coming in, where when this initially happened, everything's taken away. We didn't know what to expect. And so we all sort of scrambled and readjusted and found routines. And then we became hopeful. The weather was getting better in much of the country. We had more light. We gained our freedoms back. And now it's like, the idea of going back into a space that we've been before that we know was challenging. I think it's harder to do again.
And we don't have the nice weather to be outside and, all of those things we could go do. Now it's a lot more like literally being stuck in our houses.
Yes. Yes. So I think a lot of people are feeling this in a different way this time.
Yeah. So, what are some coping strategies? What are some ways to think about this? What are some things that people can do during this time when they're wondering, like, how am I gonna get through the day without on my people contact, without socializing, all of that?
And I say this, Tammy, too, because I know for everybody's in different parts of the country, and some of your viewers might be in different parts of the world where they may be on lockdown right now, as we speak, if they're in Europe or other parts of the world. But I think some of the coping strategies remain the same. And first I'll start off with maintaining routine. It's so important to set up a routine for yourselves. Our brains like routine. Our brains like familiarity. That's why I think part of why people had such a hard time initially, because it's all of a sudden these things that bring us comfort every day that we didn't realize that were mundane actually are settling to the brain. So making sure that you get up every day, try to mimic some of our lives before. So getting up every day and getting dressed and getting ready for work, finding balance in your day. So making sure that you work, make sure that you get outside a little bit, even if it's cold and you got to hunker down and put your boots on and a coat and get some sunlight during the day and get some sort of exercise if you can, even if that's just walking a little bit or getting some movement inside your apartment. If you do an online video and you do Pilates, depending on your physical capabilities and what you can do to make sure that you're getting some movement and stimulation to the brain. Then the other thing is setting up ritual routines for recreational and social time. So many of us, I think that's part of the loss. We really miss those traditions. Those are the things that break up time, missing weddings and Thanksgiving with everybody together, and those life cycle events is what breaks up the monotony of just work and school. But trying to find some time to read and catch up on movies that you haven't watched in a long time, doing board games, coming up with different things that you can do. If you were someone that liked cultural events, watch a streamlined show. There's a ton of theater that's out there, or listening to a favorite band or musician that you would go potentially go see live. In addition to that, making sure you stay connected with people. One thing that we're so lucky, you and I are doing this right now, and you're in Seattle, I'm here in Long Island, and we're having a conversation, and this is great. So, and I think really to cut out on the isolation, it's very easy for us to get disconnected, and Zoom doesn't feel the same way, of course, as the hug that we would have in person or doing an activity with somebody in person. um, but that ability to stay connected is what decreases isolation. And you can talk to your friends, make sure you set something up consistently. Say, hey guys, you know what, I haven't heard from you in a while, I would love if we could do you have some time in the next couple weeks and we can do a Zoom dinner or a Zoom game night or a Zoom happy hour. Add an activity with your Zoom. If we all get together and when this is all over and we go back to social activities, you don't say, hey, do you want to sit across from me and not do anything else, and we're just going to stare at each other? That's
Right.
not normal
It's
social interaction, right? What
yeah,
do we
it's not
do?
very natural.
No, we share a meal, you go for a walk, you do an activity that you enjoy. So try to bring some of that to this video conferencing, so it doesn't feel like, okay, we're just sitting here talking and I'm kind of bored. Do something that you would have done before. Do some of the things that I mentioned before, cooking class, do get creative, do games, do something to keep your brain kind of active and fun.
I love it. I love it. I was actually just chatting with my mom a day or two ago about getting together for a Zoom Thanksgiving. We're recording this the week of Thanksgiving. It'll come out afterwards. So, but yeah, and especially when we've got family all over the place. Like when I was a kid, we used to always do that. I mean, it was a phone call, right? But we always connected with family who might not have been close on Christmas, Thanksgiving, those kinds of things, and we can actually just keep doing that, where we're kind of got out of the habit of that kind of thing because it was easier to be close, but
Yeah.
yeah.
It still works. That's right. And I think, Chama, like that's a perfect example doing a Zoom Thanksgiving, even though you're not seeing the other person. I think sometimes it's easier to say, well, I'm just not going to do anything. And if we don't do anything, then the isolation starts to feel more intense because then you're really not connected and then you can feel more of a loss.
I was thinking when you were talking earlier about the routines and like doing some of the normal things, so often, like just thinking about my own past, times where it was like vacation or whatever, and then you just like don't do anything and you sit around in your pajamas, and it's like I actually end up feeling worse than when I'm not on vacation. It's like, that's not right. But I think it's a lot of what you're talking about, the routines, the actually getting up, getting dressed,
Yeah.
you know?
You don't think of it. I mean, you don't think of why it's so important until you do it or until you don't do it. And part of the reason for that too is it's easy for all of our brains to wander. We're all going through, outside of COVID, we still have the same stressors. We still have our health stressors, we still have relationship stressors or work stressors that come up. And what gets us through in normal times is going about your day and continuing to do things. And if we don't do that and we're kind of sitting around and we're not thinking about it, or we don't break up our day and we realize, wow, I've just been sitting on my computer for 6 hours, your brain kind of goes, oh.
Yes, it does.
It's the same thing of screen time, why we tell kids not to sit in front of screens forever because our brains need different types of stimulation.
Mhm, mhm. And I think too, one of the things my husband and I have done over the last few months is thinking about how we can do some things together that maybe we used to do separately. So, even if that's like still playing computer games, but finding games that we can play together, or if we're reading books, like reading some of the same books and talking about them, or listening to an audiobook together instead of just separate, to try to bring a little bit more of that community feeling than just each of us doing our isolated things.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and whoever it is that you live with, if you live with a roommate or you live with, a significant other, a partner, or you're living with family members right now, I know a lot of people are living in different sort of circumstances, or if you're living by yourself, is to try to find a way to connect.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, I know it's really easy for us to say things like, keep a routine, keep doing some of those things, get up and get dressed, even if you don't feel like it. But what if you really don't feel like it? Then what? Do you have some tips, some ideas? Like, how do you get over that initial hump of doing what seems almost counterintuitive?
I think part of it is setting realistic goals, and then also, and then being kind to yourself to say, like, okay, let's say your goal this week. I had a patient whose goal was, he had stopped working out and stopped exercising. He had had an injury and had sort of gotten out of the routine and said, okay, well, we tried it last week. You couldn't do it. Work was busy. Be kind to yourself that you didn't do it last week. There's next week that you can try again. So I think, don't entirely say, okay, I'm not going to do this because I can't. But I think, one, be kind to yourself and say, all right, this might take a little bit more time. Two, figure out why you can't do that. What is it that's preventing you from doing that routine? So, for example, if you're someone who used to do, your physical activity, your exercise, you would do it in a workout club, or you did it with your physical therapist, or as you and I have talked about, like, you don't have access to a pool to do physical therapy anymore, or how can I do this in a way that might work better for me? What's my resistance? Or time of day. Some people, really are not morning people, and they're trying to force themselves to do something in the morning. So kind of listen to yourself and ask yourself, how is it that I can best reinstitute whatever it is that I need to do? And then two, what is it that's preventing me from doing that? And then try to accommodate that and make a modification to reintegrate yourself.
Yes, definitely. That what you're describing there is exactly what I do with my clients, and I think it's so important to, when you're asking those questions, really pay attention to what comes up, because a lot of times when you think about things like what's the barrier that's keeping me, from doing this, it might be something so small that you feel a little bit dumb that it's keeping you from doing the thing, right? But those are all like those little barriers can be huge barriers. One of the examples that I ran across years ago was I realized that if there was stuff on the counter, I was less likely to cook because I'd have to clean the counter before I could cook, right? And it's like, well, yeah, of course, but at the same time, like, instead of jumping right to let's make more healthy meals at home, start with the step of let's keep the kitchen counters clean.
Yes, exactly. It's steps. Yes, that's right. And we all do what we're drawn to doing. So pay attention to that. Like, say, okay, well, if I don't really feel like doing this, maybe there's a different
Yeah. Yeah, and baby steps, right? So if getting up and getting dressed sounds like a lot to do right now, maybe just put on clean pajamas.
way. Yep. Exactly. And maybe for you, maybe you realize, part of that is you're staying up really late.
Oh, totally. Yep.
So that might be the goal, to say, okay, I'm going to try to see if we can incrementally try to go to bed a little bit earlier. It might be easier for me to get up. Or maybe you're someone that just needs to change their clothes at, lunchtime, and maybe that's okay, and maybe that's your routine, but at least you figured out that, okay, at lunchtime this is what I'm going to do.
Mhm. Right, right. I love that, listening to your own natural wants, desires, things you like. It is so impossible to keep doing something that you don't like.
Correct. And that applies to any time. That applies pre-COVID. To say, and I think, ask yourself, when I think about, when I say maintain a routine, what are the things that we did in our lives before to maintain balance? Because we all do better when there's balance. So, if we're all just working all the time and things are challenging and stressful at work, then all of a sudden you're burned out. But if you're making sure that you've got a fun Zoom night planned with friends you haven't talked to in a while, and you're going to you're going to cook you looked up a recipe and you're going to cook up a new meal, or you're going to go for a bike ride. All those things kind of temper your difficult day, at the job. But if we put all our eggs in one basket, then it makes each of those things a little bit more tenuous.
Mhm. Yes, definitely, definitely.
And think about what you did pre-COVID. So, like, what'd your day look like and what worked for you? So, if you got up every day and you had, routine that you got up and, had to walk your dog and went for coffee, well, okay, you might not be going outside to go for coffee anymore. Maybe you don't go to Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks anymore, but, you make your coffee at home and recreate that, but still go for that walk.
So one of the things that I think is coming out of what you're saying is that we need to be purposeful. And that none of these things are just going to happen by accident, right? Like, we're not going to have the connections that we want to have if we're not purposeful about making time and space and ways to have those connections. So what are some of the purposeful things that you guys have done? I mean, one was moving out of the city. That was a very purposeful
Yes,
way for you
that
to
was
stay healthy.
a big lifestyle change. I feel like I've been in a witness protection program for the last 8 months. But you know what? One of the purposeful things that we did, and I think there's a lot of good things that have come out for COVID. So for those of you listening, wherever, New Yorkers, I think, had a very different experience because obviously we were the first place in the United States. Well, actually, Washington, where you were, had COVID cases, but I think that the intensity really in New York City sort of was highlighted in the pandemic, but our lifestyle in particular does not bode well for COVID pandemic.
That was, I think, one of the biggest differences. I mean, yes, I mean, here in Washington is where it all kicked off, but we're more spread out. Like, we're not physically as close together as you are in New York, and I think that that changed the whole. Even though all of it was happening here, it was still several miles away from me, and it didn't feel so up close and personal, where I'm sure for you it very much was.
Yeah, yeah. And New Yorkers live communal living. So you share shared space in buildings, you share train access, your transportation, everything that you're doing is shared. So first and foremost, we wanted to be safe. So that was our original reason for leaving, was to go to Cleveland. I grew up close by and had access to the Cleveland Clinic. And at that point in New York, all medical care had shut down. And for me, I'm on IV antibiotics and I have weekly doctor's appointments. So I needed to be able to have access to care. Um, and actually, at that time, the day of the lockdown, I was supposed to have surgery on my port and it got canceled. So that's why we made the decision. But even in that, we were able to, one was access to care, and two, also to be able to be in a safe space that, communal living was no longer safe for me. And then the second part of us kind of returning to the area in July, but not going back to New York because we can't quite yet, was that I thought, you know, what are the things that we can do? And we can be outside. That's the one thing that we can do. We can't be around people, we can be outside. And so here we are on Long Island, we're close to a beach. So I said, why don't we do that? So I'm able to maintain medical care and have access to care here. But we were able to shift that, and we're able to go hiking and biking and go to the beach. And we live in an area that's quite desolate, so we're not coming in contact with people. And that was a purposeful shift that I knew that, when everyone else was going back this summer and as things opened up, that we weren't going back. Like, I'm still on shoots and ladders at the shoot. So I'm still at shelter in place. I've been in shelter in place since basically the end of February. That for us, that break of being able to be outside would last for a period of time. And we feel like we've gotten a good fill of that. And we have a backyard and we can, light up a fire pit and do all these things and create some space. So that was, a privilege that we had, that we were able to move and do that. I know that there are other people who, would not be in that same circumstance, but we were able to make that happen for ourselves. And that was a bonus that came out of all of this. And I've enjoyed that change.
Absolutely. Scott and I, before all of this happened, we moved to Seattle about 2 years ago, and we've been renting since then because we didn't know exactly where we wanted to live. And in January, we found a place, put an offer on a house, all of that. And then everything shut down. Well, it was a new construction. So they weren't building our house. So hopefully we're going to be like, in the next couple of months, we'll finally be done. But that's actually been one of the things that we've done is just get in the car and drive out to look at our dirt. Drive out and look and see what had they done on the building today, and for a lot of you, maybe you don't have your own house that's being built you can go look at, but going for a drive is very COVID friendly. It's just you and your people in the car, like you're still in your isolated bubble, but you get to get out, you know?
You have oh, that's such Tammy, that's such a great example of getting in the car. To do that is you're getting out, you're changing scenery. Our brain needs a change of scenery. And that's why I said, whether you go for a walk or get in your car during the day and plan a couple trips, even if you drive around town just to look at something or drive somewhere near you that you haven't been, just to change things up a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Last week there was one day I'm like, I just need to get out of the house. Like I have to go mail something. So I'm gonna go now and I'm gonna go to the post office that's not the closest one because I need to be out of the house for a little while.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a reason cabin fever is
Is a
famous.
thing. Yes.
Right? You get cabin fever. You have to, change things up a bit, and having access to a car, which is another thing that we now have access to that we didn't have before, gives you a freedom. Those are all great things that you can do.
hmm So, one of the things that you've mentioned several times is talking about access to care. And I've seen that come up with several clients and students of mine where a lot of the things that they used to be able to do to manage their fibromyalgia, they now don't have access to. I know for a while for me, like, I couldn't go get massage. Everything was closed here in Washington for a little while, and things have opened back up a little bit, but there's still some things that just aren't available at all, right? So, what are some suggestions you have or things that you've done to help make sure that, I mean, you moved, that was one of the big ones. But what are some of the other things that you've done?
I suggest talking to your care providers for finding a modification to access of care. So, for example, I used to get my infusions in an infusion at my doctor's office in their infusion lab. That no longer was safe for me to sit with a bunch of patients who also could be, potentially we could get each other ill. And so the modification was that we were able to access care at home. And I have a nurse that comes, to do my infusion, and we do it outside. And it's great, and it's fantastic. We do it in my backyard, and so instead of me being stuck in a doctor's office, I actually enjoy that. But, I've had, talked to my care providers about some alternatives. So it's possible, as this audience, the members have fibromyalgia, to say, there's a lot of body work involved. Are there practitioners in your area who can safely come to your home, and maybe they will be able to do therapeutic massage outside, and they can wear an N95 mask? There are a lot of providers who now are doing home care. I have had quite a few providers that are doing home care. In fact, actually, my physician, part of the reason we're here is he was able to make my immunologist made his home medical facility, and I'm able to go outside and meet with him here, and he spent more time out here to keep himself safe from the city. So there are ways that maybe some of those practices that you have, whether you're seeing, whoever it is that you're seeing to do some of the body work or managing some of those cases, also telehealth. For those of you who've not accessed telehealth, it's really a great diagnostic alternative that you don't have to be in a situation that might feel unsafe. And also check in with your providers about what may be safe. They may, at this point too, many of our healthcare facilities have been able to catch up with the times and make healthcare accommodations that they may be in a safer situation where they may have air filtration units that may make the space cleaner. There may be a larger period of time where patients aren't coming in. So try to find out if there's an alternative to what you were doing before.
I know just watching what's happened with my own care, when everything first shut down, I know like my massage therapist, a lot of it was just, okay, I need to stop for a minute so that I can figure out how to do this safely. Like we can't have a bunch of different people in the clinic at the same time. Like how do we do this? And then once they figured that out, they were able to open back up, just one person, one therapist, cleaning, alternating rooms so that you could wipe down the tables and then let them sit for a minute. There's a lot of things. And so I think if you have a place where you don't feel safe, first off, listen to that. But number two, just know that people are like, we're all learning as we go along here. And maybe what wasn't safe back in April is a totally different situation now. And ask lots of questions, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is, Tammy, that's such a good point. It's, I always say this too, it's safety first. And check in with your own self too to say, okay, what do I feel safe with today? Because what you might have felt safe with a month ago because, the numbers were looking better and people may have felt more comfortable a month or 2 months ago going in and seeing some of the practitioners. Now we may feel, a little bit different, but we might say, hey, what do we think? Should I just take off, maybe skip Thanksgiving for a little bit and wait a little while and maybe it'll be safer and maybe I'll feel a little bit more comfortable going back in after the holidays. So, and figuring things out. But you're exactly right. Like this has been a learning curve and a lot of places have caught up with that so that they can protect us and that things that may have felt unsafe then may be much safer now.
hmm Another thing to consider that just I was just reminded of was I had one provider who offered me to be able to come in for the first appointment of the day when everything was clean and fresh. So if you have extra concerns, if you're like Jody and have an immune system that's not going to protect you, making the choice to come in first thing when everything's clean and fresh,
Yes,
might be
that's
smart.
right. And also too, like, you'll find I ask those questions and I talk about that with the care providers. And I feel like people have gone out of their way to try to do that too. And you'd be surprised. So, and if you have access to a backyard or a front porch and, talk to your care providers. A lot of places right now, as where we are in the pandemic, they may not feel as comfortable, or some of the places that they're working may be closed. So they may feel more comfortable coming out to your home. And if they're able to wear a mask and be outside, or if you feel comfortable, coming to the home and that feels more comfortable and safe to you, if your provider's wearing a mask, that might be an alternative too.
And don't underestimate Zoom either. I mean, during the quarantine, I actually worked with a physical therapist several times by Zoom. I wouldn't have thought physical therapy by Zoom, but it was amazing.
I've had a lot of my patients have been doing physical therapy by Zoom and have found it to be quite helpful. It's a great, telehealth is really a great alternative, and I'm an example for that for mental health. A lot of my patients who hadn't done telehealth before have now made that transition, and you adjust to it, and you find that some of these things still work.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. In fact, I'm hoping some of the telehealth stuff is goodies we get to keep. Some of the upside we get to keep from our quarantine.
Well, and I think for those of us out there, I mean, everybody on this podcast is, is facing chronic healthcare conditions, and my hope of some of the good things that come out of that is a lot of the modifications might help us. It's difficult and time consuming to get around and go to all of our appointments, and maybe some of these transitions will help make some of this easier.
Yes, definitely. So, the other thing that I wanted to talk about with you is the mental health aspect. I know coping is part of mental health, but I think a lot of people like depression is so much more challenging right now. A lot of people are seeing an uptick in their anxiety. You mentioned post traumatic stress. There's a lot of these things that are kicking up. And I guess one of my first questions would be, how how do I know if this is just I'm feeling depressed because I can't be with the family and it's Thanksgiving holiday time, or I really need to be like this is something that needs to be addressed with a mental health professional. So that would be my first question. How do I know if this isn't just like situational or if I actually need to be treated for something?
So if it's clinical, and situational circumstances can lend into a clinical situation, and I think that's a really good question. I had there was an interesting article this past I think it was this past weekend. It may have been I read so much on mental health all the time, but it was a therapist talking about how not everybody's depressed right now. Part of it is just feeling sad, and that's normal right now to feel sad because there is so much loss right now. I think the judgment call that I always make is that if you're noticing a level of functioning where there's a decrease in your level of functioning that persists longer than 2 weeks. So, one of the signs of clinical depression anxiety is getting physical symptoms. So if you feel feelings of panic, you feel tearfulness in circumstances that you normally wouldn't feel tearful about, perseveration of thoughts where, let's say, something happens at work and it might be stressful, but then it tips into a negative spiral of a narrative of things that bother me. So I had a bad day at work, or I had a, situation that might have been conflictual. And then I start getting into thoughts of self-deprecation, like, oh, I'm going to lose my job. And, things never go the way that I want them to. And it's difficult to get out of it. Some people will feel withdrawn where they are not wanting to connect with other people or talk to other people, feeling irritated or agitated. Also, if you feel like that across the board, so I'll have patients who will sort of check in and be like, I'll ask them questions. Okay, well, were you irritated because of this situation in the context of that? And then we start talking about different aspects of their life, and they say, oh, gee, I'm kind of irritated at everything. Everything's bothering me. That's a sign that your mood is off. So that's the question. And then to say, do I know why my mood is off? And if you actually don't know, it may be that there's a series of environmental circumstances that are then tipping off into a clinical situation. And then going into the most severe, that you're having suicidal ideation. And often those thoughts come without intent, and people will feel sometimes shame and guilt over that. Well, they'll say, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just thought that. I would never try to hurt myself, but I was kind of thinking that. And so it may be a flash of a thought, but if you're getting into that realm where you are having suicidal ideation, which means like you might have thoughts of like, God, I wish things would be easier, or maybe if I wasn't here, or thinking about actually hurting yourself, then those at that point, that's clinical, and that needs to be addressed with therapy and medication. On the other spectrum of what's going on right now is that, many of us are experiencing grief and loss and trauma. And so, there is a normal sense that, if you're sad over the holidays and you're feeling isolated and you're feeling lost, that doesn't mean that you're depressed. There's an exact reason, that, and you may feel that. And if that lifts, after the holidays, and you're sort of like, okay, the holidays have passed, if that continues to move on, then that might be a sign that you're moving into a clinical presentation. And also sorry, Tammy, to not feel shame in that. There are many people this year that we've had so many transitions that how can you not get depressed or anxious? It's, we've had so many transitions and so much loss that try not to shame yourself around that too. If you need to get help, make life easier.
Right. And just because you're getting help doesn't mean there's like something permanently wrong with you. Like it's totally okay to get help because you're going through a hard season, you know? And anybody listening to this podcast most likely has fibromyalgia. And then we just added this on top of that, right? So we're not just dealing with one thing that might cause you to be feeling loss and grief. Now we've got multiple things. And if it ever feels like it's just too much for you to handle, it's totally okay to get help. Like that's what people like Jodi are here for.
Absolutely. And it makes it better and easier. That's the thing. Our role is, my role as a therapist is to help figure out what's going on and then strategize how to make it better and how to make it easier for you. And there's not a stigma to that. And Tammy, I also love what you said too, that like, the people listening today, have fibromyalgia. And, you know, that added layer of managing a chronic healthcare condition during normal times, everything that we're doing, you have to be thinking about that, right? There's the layer of, when am I going to have a flare, and am I going to miss this isn't the first Thanksgiving. I'm sure your audience has thought about, wait a second, am I going to be able to go, or how am I going to feel, or what modification might I need to make, given your time of year and the flares. So adding on top of that, the pandemic just makes it more stressful for anybody dealing with a chronic healthcare condition right now. We've got some stuff.
We do. So for people who might be thinking, okay, maybe I could use a little bit of help. What does that look like? Speaking as a therapist, what does that look like in like for somebody who would just be starting off looking for a little bit of help? Are they going to their primary care? Are they just like looking for a therapist? Like what would be their steps?
The first step would be to see a therapist, a trained mental health therapist. Primary cares are good for, they may have a referral for people that they know, but they're not trained in mental health. And so checking in, you can check in with a primary care, who might be a trusted person, and say, hey, I do have this going on. Do you know somebody, who may be helpful, as a helpful way? Or check in with someone who may have a therapist, and say, often people will make personal referrals. And, you can also do some research online to find providers that are located in your area. A really great resource would be to go to, it's SAMHSA National Helpline. So this particular helpline is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It is a fabulous resource. Um, so I will give that contact information to Tammy. The phone number is 1-800-662-HELP. And what's really great about that is they have it's a 24-hour service, 24 hours, 7 days a week, and they can connect you with local mental health and substance use providers in your area. And they also can recommend community resources. They also have materials and resources that you can read. And depending on if you have insurance or you don't have insurance, it's a really great resource to check in the States to try to find something locally.
Awesome. We will definitely go ahead and put that in today's show notes. So if you guys didn't catch that link, just go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com/51 for today's episode. We'll have that link there, the phone number and all the goodies for you. Awesome.
Yeah, but thank you, Tammy, for asking that, because I think the hardest part about mental health is people don't know how to get started, and that process can seem daunting. And I think step one, find a therapist. So look online, check in with people, check in with trusted medical professionals or resources. Another check in maybe too is check in with your local providers who may know therapists in your area who may treat patients with chronic healthcare conditions such as myself.
So that was actually going to be my very next question was when you're looking for a therapist, how important do you think it is to find somebody who understands working with chronic health conditions?
I think that it's a valuable resource if there are local providers in your area. So if you have, if you have access to providers who do treat chronic healthcare conditions, that would be a wonderful resource. If that's available, and I would check in with some of your providers, check in with some of the support community individuals. They may know people who, who are licensed in your area, and then the other thing to think about is, kind of who would you feel comfortable talking to? So I always say, check in, would you feel comfortable talking to a male or a female? What age group would make you feel comfortable in terms of speaking to someone? So you may want someone who's in the same age frame, so that you can talk about developmental issues. So put some thought into what would make you feel comfortable.
That is great advice. That is great advice. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it can be super helpful having somebody who understands, but a lot of what we're dealing with right now is I mean, this is what you guys are trained for, whether you understand living with a chronic illness or not, like this is what you're trained for.
All therapists are trained to deal with mental health issues, and there aren't as many therapists who do treat chronic healthcare conditions. There are more and more, and I'm glad to see that more and more are coming, and finding this area of expertise, which usually a lot of people don't realize chronic illness is not a specialty area for therapy. And so most of the practitioners that are doing it are people like myself who have a chronic health care condition themselves and became involved, unless you're working in an oncology unit or a pain clinic where they do have some on staff people. And more, I hope that we do have more and more therapists that are working in this space. And particularly in the last 10 years, that's increased. But therapists are trained to deal with mental health. So find somebody that you can connect with.
Excellent. Excellent. One other question along these lines. I think a lot of times when people feel like depressed, wondering, if they should quote get help, that getting help often looks like medication. Can you speak to that and what role medication plays, where that falls in?
Sure. And I think that goes along, Tammy, with the first question of like where to start. And the place to start is with a therapist. So, even if you are going to go on medication, you're still going to need a therapist. So, psychiatrists and nurse practitioners. So are able to there's mental health nurse practitioners, psychiatrists, and then some primary cares do distribute medication, but I recommend going to a specialist who actually specializes in this. It's a better outcome, and they can really monitor your care. But the first step is to have a mental health therapist, because if you do have a clinical depression or anxiety, or you're managing medication, you still need the talk component. To deal with the education around it, helping you develop coping strategies, dealing with some of the environmental triggers and figuring out what's environmental and what might be clinical, and coordinating. So the first step is to go to a therapist and then talk to that therapist and find out, and you guys can kind of work together and allow that therapist to make that assessment and see if you do need to see a medical practitioner who can properly prescribe medications.
Perfect. Perfect. I think a lot of times we think mental health help automatically equals medication, and it doesn't. So and isn't shouldn't even be the first step
Right,
necessarily.
and let the mental health professionals, they'll be able to make that assessment. And sometimes, for some people, and particularly for this year, the things that have been triggered, and all of the environmental stressors, some of it may be just helping you to work through some of those transitions, and you're able to, some of those clinical symptoms can lift. So it doesn't mean you're going in straight into medication. The other component to this is as medicine has progressed, I know there are people on this podcast who might be, on multiple medications for various reasons and may have reactions and may be reactionary. And so the idea of adding a psychotropic, can be daunting. And one of the things that has been great that has come up in the last it started about 10 years ago, but really has progressed as you can get genomic testing for psychotropic medication now. There's two companies that do it, Genosite and Genomind. Many practitioners are now getting trained in this and the genomic testing. If you go to medical school and you train to be a psychiatrist or you're a psychiatric nurse practitioner, you will get trained in the genomic testing now. And so I can't even read the antibodies now, but everybody is very individual. So, for example, all of my patients had very different reasons for why they would respond to different medications, and all of them were different. Some people metabolize medications differently. There's a lot of different reasons why you might need psychotropic medications, but by getting the genomic testing, which is a swab you can do at home, and the practitioner can then assess it, it may help you to not have as many side effects, which might be something that may deter you from wanting to go on psychotropic medication if you need it.
Absolutely. So, if I'm reading between the lines, these tests would tell you things like, "Oh, you're not going to respond as well to this particular medication, so we can make sure we give you the right one." Or, "Oh, there's something in your genes that says you don't make serotonin well, so this isn't something you can talk yourself out of."
I mean, you said it exact. I couldn't have said it better. It's exactly it. You get the information back. It has all the antibodies. It goes through everything, every single psychotropic medication. Tells you which ones you would have a reaction to, but then also tells you why. Like you may have a cortisol spike, and then and the other bonus of doing that testing, which I think you just brought up, is it shows you actually there's a medical reason that this is happening, and that may help you to feel less of the personal stigma if you were making that choice to go on psychotropic medication.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think so often that the last episode we were just talking about should I take medication or not for fibromyalgia. And those of you who haven't heard it, go back, listen to episode 50. But a couple of the things in there, one of them is like, there's no morality with medication. Like it feels so often like we're trying to white knuckle our way through and we somehow are a better person if we can do it without medication. And I just like, no.
Right? Let's make it. I mean, we didn't choose to have our diseases, right? Like that part was not our choice, but we can choose to make things easier. And if there's a medication that we can take that will help improve our life and our ability to function, well, I'm all for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And there's ways now to do it without the side effects, which may be some of the issues as to why people feel
Right. It
this.
becomes a lot less trial and error. I mean, it still might be some trial and error, but at least it's more informed.
But I love it. It's like, you know what? Let's make things easier. And there's some science behind it.
Love it. I love it. So as we wrap up our episode today, I know one of the big things that we wanted to talk about was coping with the loss of our holidays and all that isolation. And I know we've covered a lot of that. But I know this was something you in particular wanted to talk about. So I just want to give you a minute to just sort of speak to those who are listening, like from your heart to theirs. Like, what do we do right now, Jodi?
Listen, I know how hard this is. I'm having to go through it too. And I'm sad that I'm not going to be at my cousins this year with the rest of our family. And that's been our tradition the last couple of years. And but I think the biggest thing to remember is that this time will pass. That this is 1 year out of our lives. It's one sacrifice. And as Anthony Fauci said last week, hope is on the way. A vaccine. I may have said this very differently 2 months ago, but we now know a timeline that we have vaccines that give us the potential to reach herd immunity and within the next probably 6 months to a year. And so that means that this isn't forever. And so the hope is that, next year we're going to be able to celebrate with everybody, but that this year it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to miss everybody. But it's 1 year out of your life that you can maintain some safety. And even though you may miss everyone around you, guess what? Like, we'll be able to do that next year.
Yep. Definitely. And I think too, like one of the things that I keep thinking is if we do it right, we won't have to do it again. Right? So like stay home, wear your mask, wash your hands, don't get together in groups, like do all the things that you're supposed to do, and then we can get over this thing.
Yes, that's right. Just do it. And the other thing that I do suggest for people is try to do something. So try to, even though, I mean, sometimes it's easier to be like, okay, well, I'm not going to see anybody. So we're just not going to do it. And let's just eat pizza. That's going to make you feel so much worse because our traditions are something that bring us joy every year. And the tradition is to eat food with people we love and we care about. So you can still do that. It just you might be eating separately from them this year. And and try to continue to do that and call the people that you love and connect with them for the holidays this year. We all miss each other. And the hope is that next year we can all do this the right way and the way that we have every other year.
Yes, yes. So, my homework assignment for everyone who is listening, if you have not set up a day and a time to connect with those people that you love, I want you to go do that right now. Whether that's going to be setting up a time to try a Zoom call or FaceTime or even just a phone call. I want you to go set up a time to connect with the people that you love and actually have it be a day and a time on your calendar, something to look forward to, something that's scheduled. A lot of times we talk about doing things, but because we don't schedule it, it doesn't happen. So that's my homework assignment for everybody listening today.
I love that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jodi. There's so many more things that we could talk about. We'll definitely have to have you back again.
Thank you so much for having me and a happy holidays to everybody. Let's stay safe so we can do this again next year.
Absolutely. I will end on that. Thanks again, Jodi.
All right. Thanks, Tabby.
And that wraps up another episode of the Fibromyalgia Podcast. If you're ready to see if working with a fibromyalgia coach can help you feel better faster, visit fibromyalgiapodcast.com where you can schedule a complimentary consultation to explore your options. During this call, we'll discuss your fibromyalgia journey, what your needs and challenges are, and give you recommendations on how to reach your goals the quickest way possible. Thank you for tuning in today and join us next time as we explore more ways to help you take back control of your life and health. My music and sound editing were done by Daniel Munkus at Subtle Soup Records. Podcast management and creative copy by Sonia Louise of Performance Podcasting.